everyone, I'm Olga Yaroshevsky, and this is NexChange interview series, where Hong Kong Blockchain Week speakers share their unique views and insights about blockchain and innovation. And it's my pleasure to introduce Lisa O'Connor. She's the Managing Director of Securities and Treasury and Standards, Asia Pacific of SWIFT. Hi, Lisa. Welcome.
Hello. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. So Lisa was a true star of the conference, sharing her views from a bank's perspective. Lisa, can you please tell us how did you like the event?
I thought the event was fantastic. I was really impressed at the amount of people that turned out. I know that it's a relatively kind of new discussion in the industry over the last, let's say, 5 years or so. But the amount of interest that comes from the financial services sector and also those outside of the financial services sector and the tech sector who are looking to get more involved is very impressive. So I'm very happy to have been involved this year and hope to continue to be involved in the program going forward.
Thank you. So I know that SWIFT, and you actually mentioned it during your speech at the Hong Kong Blockchain Week. I know that SWIFT selectively looks at DLT technology as a solution for some of the industry problems and some issues. And as a result, on March 6th, and I think it's right when Hong Kong Blockchain Week was in full swing, SWIFT announced a partnership with leading security software provider, SLIB. Am I saying this right? SLIB, and the Singapore Exchange, along with a number of banks. This was all to test a DLT-based e-voting solution, right? Please tell us more about this project. This is very, very interesting.
Okay, I'd be happy to. So maybe just a little bit first about SWIFT and why we're interested in DLT and how we're actually getting involved in the discussions. So SWIFT at its very core is a platform company. We connect the financial services world. Some describe us as the oldest cloud in financial services. We have about 11,000 financial institutions globally which are connected to us. And as a result of being this type of platform company, we've always been kind of transactional in our nature of what goes across the network between counterparties. As we move forward, though, and we look at SWIFT from a platform perspective, the idea is how do we co-create, how do we create the best of what's out there in the industry and help to in some way provide access to our community and access to allowing these solutions to grow. So one of those ideas is, of course, and in certain selective instances, we look at DLT or blockchain as a technology. And in one case, we looked at DLT together with SLIB, you are correct in saying it, who is a proxy voting platform, which is based on DLT technology, which comes out of France. And we worked together with them because SWIFT for many years had the kind of solution about how parties in the industry interact as it relates to a proxy voting process. And proxy voting is just something as simple as, for example, if you own a share in a company and the company has an annual general meeting and they have certain things on their agenda that they want you to vote on, it's how you put your interest, how you vote your interest. And so we've had a solution around how this is done between different actors in the industry for a while. And so what we did was we worked with SLIB and helped them together with our community, so SGX and 4 banks, to create kind of on-ramps and off-ramps to their DLT environment. So using messaging, using APIs to connect to the DLT environment, to update that, and also to get information off of it. But really, why is this important? It's important because at the end of the day, proxy voting is a bit of a broken process in our industry, in that there's never been a solution that brings all players together that really provides the transparency, speed, and accuracy around the votes. And this now allows us to do that. This is a solution which allows investors who are very interested in making sure that their vote is counted to be able to understand that they have upheld their fiduciary responsibility and made sure that that is, in fact, included. So that's why it's important to our industry to kind of crack this problem, which has been one that's been out there for at least over a decade.
And by the way, do you think that blockchain, so blockchain is considered to be one of those technologies who will help to put voting, on a legislative, on a city level, on a federal level, this voting on a completely different level, to put a lot more transparency in it? Do you think this will work? If we start with this type of voting that you are testing right now, can we eventually put it to like a government level?
So SWIFT, from our perspective, we work more in financial services with banks and with investors, and so that has been our focus. But you could hypothetically say that if it works for any voting process, you could transport it into other areas of the world, other areas and different industries could potentially benefit. But really, what we're trying to do here is make sure that a process that has not worked traditionally, that has been very labor intensive, that has had a lot of people against it, that also has not allowed investors who are interested in making sure, let's say from a corporate social responsibility perspective, that they're voting in ways that their owners want them to vote. They haven't been able to necessarily always get that information back in the future, that their vote or in the past that their vote is counted, and now going forward in the future they'll have that potential. But I do think that DLT has the potential to provide transparency, accountability and results in a way that we have not seen before when there's multiple actors in a chain of a transaction.
Now to the next pilot project, the next test ground, which is called the Global Payment Initiative Service, right? Which aims to compete with the growing threat of competing blockchain and fintech solution provided by institutions like Ripple, JP Morgan, and TransferWise. So according to announcement released earlier this year, the pilot, this GPI pre-validation service, was set to kick off at the beginning of 2019 with 15 selected banks, including JP Morgan, Barclays, Bank of China. So the service is expected to provide total transparency to payment beneficiaries and originators, making the cost, routes, and delivery of their funds very highly predictable. Is the service being tested right now? And can you evaluate how this initiative works? Does it work?
Sure. So maybe just first a little bit about GPI. So GPI is something that SWIFT launched a while ago, which is actually not a DLT-based solution, but it's something that looks at how can you remove the friction as it exists in the current payment chain. And what it looks at is the friction around the time that it requires to make a payment end to end, the friction and visibility around fees, etc. So what it looks to do is it looks to remove all of that. And that has been live for over actually 2 years, I think now. And so GPI is live. We do about 300 billion a day over GPI. And what it does is it provides the traceability of the transaction. It provides the transparency into the fees and the transparency so the end beneficiary of that transaction knows that it will be delivered to them end to end. And most of our payments of those 300 billion are done within 30 minutes. And that's down from a time where it used to take, let's say, 3 days to make a payment. But this is very much leveraging the SWIFT platform and very much leveraging the existing SWIFT rails, which is why we were able to go from 0 to 300 billion in less than 2 years, which is really unheard of in other DLT or blockchain platforms. So it really had to do with our platform and our end members, and that's why we were able to get that success. So to build on that success, yes, we are offering other services off of the back of that, and one of them is pre-validation, and that service will be, so there'll be a couple services which will be coming out later this year, but the idea is certainly that you can have issues as it relates to the payments chain when something, for example, hits a filter and falls into a repair queue. At the moment when that happens as part of the chain, using GPI, you can actually get the information that the payment has been stopped and what's the reason it's been stopped. Now, what pre-validation allows you to do is validate those transactions before they go so that you know that you will not have an issue. So the idea is really to make sure that we make the cross-border payments as seamless as possible. And it really has been proven by the financial services companies that use the SWIFT network that this is possible.
ISO 20022 is called and recognized as the standard of the future. And I remember that you briefly touched this topic at the Hong Kong Blockchain Week. Can you please tell us more about how this standard is applied?
Sure. So ISO 20022 is a standard that's been in development for more than 10 years. And it's not just a messaging standard. That's kind of a misinterpretation of what it is. At its very base, it's actually business flows. So for example, when you're doing a payment, what does that look like? Who are the parties involved? What information do they send to each other, et cetera, et cetera. When you break that down to its components, you end up actually with a very rich kind of data dictionary, which allows you to reuse these components in different ways, like a recipe book. So ISO 20022 absolutely is pervasive in our industry. It's used across payments, securities, transactions. And the reason that it's done so well as a standard is really because of its flexibility and also the fact that it's an open source standard. So anybody can go to ISO 2022.org and get the information on the standard out of that. But why it's important from, maybe I'll talk first from a payments perspective and then from a securities perspective, but why it's important from a payments perspective is it allows innovation to grow. So it provides a base about how people interact, so a language, and then on top of it, it allows innovation to grow from there. So I'll give you an example of that. For example, in Australia, there's a real-time payment platform called NPP. That Australian platform actually does person-to-person payment transactions within, let's say, less than 10 seconds that does this transaction. And that's all based on ISO 20022. The idea is to then, on top of that, build a layer that allows fintech companies to plug into that fast payment utility. And that will allow those fintech companies to be able to offer services to the market. For example, let's say you want to get a mortgage and you have to do all of the document checks, you have to do et cetera, and then that results at the end of the day into a payment of your deposit. That could be a fintech company sitting on top of that does the document checking and eventually helps to initiate the payment. And what that allows you to do is, because we've agreed on the business standards and how you, for example, initiate a payment, it's then more interesting and easy for fintech companies to be able to grow on top of that, because they no longer need to worry about how do they communicate with that real-time payments platform, how do they communicate with the banks. That basis is set and it allows innovation to grow. Another example of that is we do a lot of work with the World Wide Web Consortium around payments and how payments go from a web browser. So we've worked very closely with this group over the years, which includes the like of Google, Apple, et cetera, who are all looking at a common standard on how to do payment initiations from a web browser. And they have committed themselves also to use ISO 20022. So you can see that from a Google Wallet, from an Apple Pay, all the way down through to a payment system, and in the interbank market, ISO 20022 from a payments perspective is really pervasive, and it's throughout the industry. And that's because of the work and the effort that's gone into creation of this dictionary of reusable parts that can be put throughout the chain. It's also used in other instances. So for example, in the securities markets, lots of times when you create DLT platforms, so in the instance of Australia with ASX, they're replacing their clearing and settlement system. And when they're doing that, they're replacing it with a DLT platform. That DLT platform is offered by Digital Asset Holdings, but we worked with the ASX and Digital Asset Holdings over a period of 18 months to define the business flows as well as the data model that would underpin that DLT platform. So, and that's all ISO 20022. So again, it's pervasive as it relates to the securities markets as well. So it definitely is the standard of the future. And that's because it's open source, it's rich in its content, and it is really very widely accepted by, from everyone from the, the wallet, but the person that's using it on the street all the way through to the interbank market.
And Swift is definitely a front runner in this space. Like it's
yeah, so we're lucky enough at the time of this recording to be the registration authority for the standard, which means we put a lot of work and effort into the development of the standard, the use of the standard, and we are really committed as a cooperative, and that's what makes us a cooperative by nature, to make sure that we do the best we possibly can as the registration authority for it.
We talk a lot about transparency of payments and fees. How do you think can that be achieved? And what's the desirable level of transparency in your opinion?
So I think transparency on things like fees as it relates to payments, we've gotten there already. So for example, as long as the payment is a GPI payment, there's an agreement amongst the banks as part of a rule book that they will provide transparencies and fees so that the end beneficiary knows if the originator of the payment is sending $100, they'll get X amount at the end. So the transparency in the fees is actually is clear now as it relates to GPI and relates to the rule book. But transparency is a very interesting topic beyond that. especially as it relates to DLT environments. One of the things that we have noticed is that certainly as it relates to financial services, it's more about private DLTs, private blockchains, less public, right? Especially in the regulated financial services space. And because all of the banks are regulated, lots of times there is things around data privacy that need to be adhered to from a regulatory perspective. So the nice thing about what we do from a standards point of view is that we can define the actors that are in the chain. We can even define down to a certain level of an item of data who should see what where. And that's what we've done in a lot of our proof of concepts as well. But it is really important that you get enough transparency, but that you give transparency to the right actor in the chain at the right time, as opposed to the wrong people and have issues as it relates to data privacy.
So this is, I guess, a right balance of transparency and privacy, right?
Correct. Yeah. Yeah.
So, and what's the next goal, let's say, in terms of technological development for cross-border payments? Which parameters do you think will be improved? Like, will it take, I don't know, seconds or half a second? Is it speed? Is it, again, transparency? Is it privacy? What do you think?
I think it's definitely speed. I think at the end of the day, as I mentioned, in Australia, there's a real-time payments platform there. And there's lots of real-time payments platforms in different markets, all using ISO 20022 as the standard, and many of them using SWIFT. But there's many of these real-time payment platforms in markets where you and I can make a payment to each other within a matter of seconds. The idea, obviously, in the longer term is that cross-border payments should be as frictionless as that, should be as seamless as doing a domestic payment between consumers to consumers. We should have the same experience in the cross-border space. So speed is definitely one. And it's certainly, the willingness of banks to try to speed things up too as well is really great. And the other thing that I would say is in cross-border payments, one of the things that we're working on from a speed perspective is how do you link together some of these real-time payment systems across different markets. So we have an initiative where we're looking at how do you use GPI into a real-time payment system to get as fast as possible down to a local person in that market who's attached to that real-time payment system. So that's quite interesting. But a lot of what needs to develop in order to get there are tools around AML, so anti-money laundering. So how do you do that as real-time as possible, potentially in the cloud? The other things that need to develop from here as well is the willingness and the rule book from a participant point of view. So participants need to get around this and need to create a coalition of the willing to move forward. And lastly, I would say some of the banks obviously are looking at, from a liquidity management point of view, what does it mean as they go truly real time in both the cross-border and the domestic space.
Thank you, Lisa. It was very interesting. Thank you for this talk and thank you for the conversation. Thank you for your work.
Thank you. It was really nice speaking with you. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.